This is not a hypothetical. This is not speculation. The White House has confirmed it. The United States is discussing military options to acquire Greenland. Not from an adversary, but from an ally. I'm Fareed Zakaria. And if that sentence made you pause, it should. Because for the first time in generations, the world's most powerful democracy is openly questioning a rule it once enforced, that borders between allies are not up for negotiation by force. Washington calls Greenland a national security priority. Europe calls it a violation of sovereignty. Greenlanders call it frightening. And here is the truth you need to understand. This story is not about ice, minerals, or an Arctic island of 57,000 people. It is about whether power still answers to rules or whether rules now answer to power. If you want to understand how the global order is quietly shifting beneath your feet, stay with me. Because the real question is not what the United States wants. It is why now, to understand this moment, we have to strip away the headlines and look at the problem clearly. Greenland is a semi-autonomous territory under Danish sovereignty. Denmark is a NATO ally. The United States is the leading power in that alliance. And yet, the White House now says acquiring Greenland is a national security priority with military force explicitly left on the table. That alone changes the nature of the discussion. This is no longer a debate about diplomacy or economics. It is a question about how far security logic can stretch before it breaks the rules meant to contain it. European leaders responded quickly. They drew a line around sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the basic premise of the UN Charter. Greenland's leaders asked for dialogue and for respect under international law. Ordinary Greenlanders spoke of fear, of being talked about, not talked to. So the issue before us is precise and deeply uncomfortable. What happens when the language of national security collides with the foundations of alliance trust? And to answer that, we need to go back not years, but decades to see where this logic was born. To understand how we arrived here, we need to rewind the clock not to a single speech or a single president, but to a longer historical arc. Since the end of the Cold War, the Arctic was treated as a peripheral space, frozen, remote, strategically quiet. But history has a habit of thawing along with geography. As ice melts, new shipping lanes emerge. As technology advances, previously inaccessible resources become reachable. And as great power competition returns, geography regains its old, brutal importance. Greenland sits at the center of that shift. For decades, the United States viewed the island through a narrow military lens, a base, a radar, a forward position. Denmark managed sovereignty. Greenland managed autonomy. The system worked because the stakes were limited. That changed when Russia and China began looking north. Suddenly, the Arctic was no longer the edge of the map. It was the next frontier. Security planners think in terms of choke points, early warning, denial of access. They do not think in terms of identity, history, or consent. And once a place is reclassified as strategic, a dangerous transformation begins. Because the logic of security rarely stops to ask who already lives there. And that brings us to the first real rupture, the moment this tension moved from theory to action. The first rupture did not happen in the Arctic. It happened thousands of miles away, in Venezuela. Elite US forces moved in. A sitting president was seized, taken to New York to face charges. For Washington, it was framed as law enforcement. For the rest of the world, it was something else entirely, a signal, a reminder that when the United States decides its interests are at stake, geography is negotiable. Then came the imagery, a map of Greenland, colored like the American flag. One word beneath it, soon. And shortly after, a senior White House figure said the quiet part out loud, that it was the formal position of the US government that Greenland should be part of the United States. When asked whether force was off the table, the answer was chilling in its confidence. Nobody's going to fight the US over the future of Greenland. This is how crises begin now. not with tanks, but with language that normalizes the unthinkable. If this feels familiar, if it reminds you of moments when power tested the edges of restraint, that's because it should. And if you're wondering how such thinking becomes acceptable inside institutions, stay with me. Because the real danger lies not in a single statement, but in the system that produces it. What sits beneath all of this is not impulse. It is a system. Modern national security operates on a simple, ruthless principle: control the terrain before someone else does. In that logic, Greenland is not a homeland. It is a platform for early warning systems, for missile defense, for power projection across the Arctic. And once security planners frame a place this way, everything else becomes secondary. Law becomes an obstacle. Allies become variables. People become background noise. This is how strategic thinking abstracts reality. It turns geography into assets, sovereignty into inconvenience, consent into delay. The White House insists no invasion is planned. Officials speak of purchase, of association, of negotiation, but they deliberately leave one door open for us because power in this system must never rule anything out. That ambiguity is the point. It pressures partners, it shifts expectations, it signals resolve without firing a shot. And here is the unsettling truth. Once military options are spoken aloud, they reshape the conversation permanently, because the system has already decided what matters most. And in moments like this, the system rarely stops itself, which is why the next escalation was almost inevitable. The second escalation was quieter and more dangerous. Behind closed doors, lawmakers were briefed, not about if Greenland mattered, but about how far the United States was willing to go. Publicly, officials emphasized restraint. Privately, contingency plans were acknowledged, because in the defense world, saying we have no plans is not the same as saying we have no options. Europe heard the signal immediately. Denmark's prime minister warned that an attack by the United States would mean the end of NATO itself. European leaders closed ranks not out of hostility toward Washington, but out of fear of precedent. Because if borders can be questioned inside the alliance, then the alliance no longer protects borders at all. This was the moment the issue stopped being bilateral. It became systemic. Trust is the invisible infrastructure of alliances. Once cracked, it does not fail loudly. It erodes silently. And while diplomats debated language, people in Greenland were left listening to something far more visceral: the sound of powerful nations discussing their future without them. And that brings us to the most human dimension of this crisis. If you live in Washington or Brussels, this sounds like strategy. If you live in Greenland, it sounds like a threat. Imagine being told that your home is suddenly strategic, that your future is being discussed in rooms you will never enter, that powerful men are debating options, including force, while insisting no one will resist. You hear officials say this is about security. But security for whom? Greenland has 57,000 people, families, communities, a language that names the land as belonging to its people. And yet many Greenlanders say they feel spoken about, not spoken with. One young Inuit man described it as terrifying, not because tanks were rolling in, but because the leader of the free world spoke of his country as something to be claimed. If you were in his place, you would feel it too. The loss of agency, the fear that history happens to small nations, not with them. This is where geopolitics stops being abstract. This is where it touches human dignity. And if this makes you uncomfortable, it should, because what happens to people on the margins today often becomes policy at the center tomorrow. And the consequences do not stop at Greenland's shores. What unfolds in Greenland does not stay in Greenland. The Arctic is no longer a frozen backwater. It is a strategic crossroads, and everyone knows it. Russia is expanding its Arctic presence. China is watching closely, drawn by resources and new trade routes as the ice recedes. And every move by the United States is read not in isolation, but as precedent. If Washington can question sovereignty inside NATO, others will ask why restraint should apply to them. Alliances are built on credibility, on the belief that power will be used predictably within agreed rules. When that belief wavers, the global system recalibrates. European leaders were clear. Arctic security must be collective, not unilateral, not coerced. Because once great powers normalize the language of acquisition, borders everywhere become less secure, especially for small states. This is how regional disputes turn global, not through invasion, but through imitation. And that is the real danger, not what happens next in Greenland, but what others learn from it. Which brings us to the future, because from this moment forward, the world can move in very different directions. From here, the future splits into three possible paths. The first is restraint. The United States pulls back from coercive language. Negotiation replaces pressure. Greenland's status is discussed only with consent within NATO and international law. Trust, once shaken, is slowly repaired. The Arctic becomes a space of managed competition, tense but stable. The second path is ambiguity. No invasion, no purchase, just continued pressure, strategic signaling, and unresolved claims. Allies adapt by hedging. They cooperate, but with less confidence. Rules still exist, but they bend. The global order survives, thinner and more fragile. The third path is the most dangerous. Force becomes normalized. Security justifies everything. If one alliance member can openly threaten another, the post-war rulebook quietly closes. Small nations draw the lesson first. They look for protectors, or they arm themselves. History tells us this clearly. World orders do not collapse in a single moment. They erode when power stops believing it needs permission. And once that belief takes hold, reversing it becomes extraordinarily difficult. Which is why how this story ends matters far beyond Greenland. And why it brings us to a final, unavoidable insight. This is how global orders change. Not with declarations, not with wars, but with sentences that would once have been impossible and are now spoken aloud. The United States says it needs Greenland for security. Europe says sovereignty is non-negotiable. Greenlanders say they want respect, not protection imposed from afar. All three claims cannot coexist forever. What you are watching is not a dispute over territory. It is a test of whether power still accepts limits, especially when it no longer feels constrained. For decades, the strength of the West was not just its military. It was its self-restraint. The belief that even the strongest nations gain legitimacy by following rules they helped write. If that belief fades, the world does not become safer. It becomes more anxious, more armed, more brittle. So when you hear leaders talk about security, ask the deeper question. Security for whom and at what cost? If this analysis helped you see the story beneath the headlines, stay with me, share this, and watch the next chapter. Because Greenland is not the end of this story. It's the warning shot.